My name is Rachel Donovan. I'm 34 years old, and on the night my husband threw me and our 4-year-old daughter out onto the front lawn in the middle of a February storm, holding a photograph he'd found in a shoebox at the back of our closet, I understood something with perfect, almost surgical clarity. Not rage, not grief, something quieter and far more dangerous. The recognition that the man screaming at me from the doorway had no idea, not even the faintest shadow of an idea, who he had just decided to destroy. He held the photo up like evidence at a trial. In it, I was 20 years old, standing in a gray-green hallway, wearing an orange jumpsuit, my hair pulled back, my face thinner than it had ever been. Behind me, visible in the frame, was the unmistakable institutional beige of a correctional facility. He was shaking. Our daughter, Lily, clung to my leg through my coat, her small face pressed into my thigh, not crying, just holding on. The porch light flickered in the wind. He said a word I will not repeat here, and then he said, "You lied to me for 7 years. Get off my property." I did not cry. I did not argue. I picked up the bag I had quietly packed 3 hours earlier, because I had seen this moment coming for 2 days, from the minute I noticed the shoebox had been moved, and I walked to my car. But before I go any further, before I tell you what my husband said next when he realized I wasn't begging, and before I tell you what happened to him 18 months later, I want to ask you something. Write it in the comments right now. What time is it where you are, and what city are you in? I'm genuinely curious how far this story travels. Okay, from the beginning. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, in a house that smelled like dryer sheets and unspoken disappointment. My mother worked doubles at a diner on Linden Avenue, and my father was what people in our neighborhood diplomatically called between opportunities, which meant he watched television from 11 in the morning until he fell asleep in the recliner sometime after the late news. I was the kind of kid who read anything she could get her hands on: library books, cereal boxes, the instruction manuals for appliances we didn't own. I was also, from a fairly young age, the kind of kid who understood that the world was not going to meet her halfway, and that if she wanted anything, she was going to have to build it herself, brick by brick, with her own hands. I was 19 when I made the worst decision of my life. I want to be precise about this, because the story I am about to tell you is not a story about victimhood, and I refuse to perform it like one. I made the decision. I was 19 years old. I was in love with a boy named Derek who had a way of making terrible ideas sound like adventures, and when he told me that his cousin needed someone to drive a car from Cincinnati to Columbus and leave it in a parking garage on Short Street, I said yes. I didn't ask what was in the trunk. I think on some level I knew I shouldn't. I told myself it was probably nothing. It was not nothing. I was pulled over on I-71, 40 minutes outside Columbus, for a broken taillight. The officer asked me to step out of the vehicle. What they found in the trunk earned me a charge of felony transport of controlled substances. Derek, who had given me the keys, was never charged with anything. He had been careful about that. He had been careful about a great many things where I was concerned, and I was too young and too infatuated to understand that careful was not the same as kind. I took a plea deal. 18 months in the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville. I served 14 with good behavior. The thing about prison that nobody tells you, the thing that isn't in the television shows or the documentaries, is how profoundly institutional it is in the most mundane possible sense. There are schedules, there are procedures, there are rules about where you stand and when you eat and how loud you can play your radio. For someone like me, someone who had spent her whole childhood watching chaos operate on a vaguely improvisational basis, the structure was, in its own perverse way, almost clarifying. You knew where you stood, you knew what was expected. The rules were arbitrary and frequently unjust, but they were consistent, and consistency was something I had never had in great supply.
The facility superintendent at the time was a man named Gerald Weston. He was 51 years old, heavyset in the way that suggested he had once been athletic and had simply stopped, with a gray mustache and reading glasses he kept pushed up on his forehead even when he wasn't reading anything. He had a reputation among the staff as being demanding but fair, which is a combination rarer in correctional administration than you might hope. I met him during my second month at a meeting about the GED program that the facility was trying to expand. I had signed up to be a peer tutor because I had nothing else to do with my time and because it seemed like it might be useful, and Gerald Weston attended the meeting to make a budget announcement and ended up staying for the whole session. He stayed because I gave a presentation. It wasn't supposed to be a presentation. I had just been asked to explain how the current tutoring schedule worked, because the current schedule was deeply inefficient in a way that seemed obvious to me and inexplicable, in the sense that nobody had apparently noticed. I laid it out on the whiteboard. Weston sat in the back of the room with his arms crossed, watching. When I finished, he said, "How long have you been here?" I told him. He said, "Who did you work for on the outside?" I told him I hadn't worked for anyone in a professional capacity yet. I was 19. He looked at me for a moment, and then he said, and left.
2 weeks later, he had me reassigned to work in the administrative offices. This was not a romantic arrangement. I want to be absolutely clear about that because I know the assumption that will form in some people's minds and it needs to be corrected immediately. Gerald Weston was a man who recognized operational competence the way some people recognize musical talent, instinctively, without much sentimentality about it. And what he recognized in me was someone who could look at a broken system and see exactly where the break was. He put me to work on intake documentation, on scheduling, on a backlog of compliance reports that had been sitting on a shelf for 8 months because nobody had had the patience to work through them. I worked through them in 6 weeks. Over the 14 months I served, Weston and I developed what I can only describe as a mentorship, built on mutual respect and an almost complete absence of small talk. He was not effusive. He did not give compliments freely. But twice, at my progress reviews, he wrote in the internal notes that I was one of the most analytically capable individuals he had encountered in his 30 years of administrative work. And I know this because he showed me what he wrote, not as praise, but as information, the way you might show someone their own test score. He said, "This is what I think. I'm telling you so you don't underestimate yourself after you leave here," and then he went back to his reports. I left Marysville at 21 with my GED, a letter of professional recommendation from a sitting correctional superintendent, and a sealed record that a very good public defender had helped me navigate before my release. Ohio law allowed for expungement of first-time nonviolent drug offenses under certain conditions, and I met those conditions with a precision that bordered on the obsessive, because I understood with a clarity that my 19-year-old self had not possessed that the record was not the end of the story. It was a door. I needed to decide what was on the other side of it. I moved to Columbus. I worked 2 jobs for 18 months, one at a copy center on High Street and one as a weekend bookkeeper for a dry cleaning chain that was, charitably speaking, in administrative disarray. The dry cleaning job was where I discovered that I had a specific and somewhat unusual talent for financial forensics, which is a term I learned later for what I was doing instinctively then. Looking at the numbers, finding where they didn't match the story, and figuring out why. The owner, a Taiwanese-American man named Henry Liu, had been bleeding money for 3 years through a combination of vendor overcharging, employee theft, and simple bookkeeping errors that had compounded into something genuinely alarming. I found it, I documented it, and I presented it to him with a spreadsheet and a summary memo that I had stayed up 2 nights writing. He gave me a raise and then told 3 of his business associates about me. By the time I was 26, I was running the back office operations for a small but respectable financial consulting firm in Dublin, Ohio, a suburb northwest of Columbus. I had taken every accounting and business administration course the Columbus State Community College offered, mostly online in the evenings, and I had sat for and passed my bookkeeping certification on the first attempt. My record was sealed. My past was, to the extent that the law allowed, no longer the dominant fact of my biography. I was careful. I was deliberate. I told almost no one. I told Marcus Donovan on our third date. I want you to remember that. Our third date. He had been forthcoming with me about his own family, about the DUI he'd gotten at 23, about the business he'd tried to start in his mid-20s that had failed badly enough to cost him his savings and most of his ego. And I felt, in the way that you sometimes feel things you later wish you had examined more carefully, that honesty was the foundation this relationship deserved. I told him about Derek, about the car, about Marysville, about Weston, about the expungement. I told him everything. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and took my hand and said, "Thank you for trusting me with that." And I believed him. We were married 2 years later, in September, at a venue outside of Powell that cost $12,000, 8 of which I paid for, though the invitation listed both our names as hosts. Marcus worked in pharmaceutical sales, which sounds more lucrative than it was at his level, and he was charming in exactly the way that pharmaceutical sales rewards and marriage eventually interrogates. Confident in surface rooms, effortlessly likable in short-term encounters, and fundamentally unequipped for the kind of sustained, granular, unglamorous effort that building an actual life requires. I understood this, I think, before I admitted it to myself. I married him anyway. People do. Lily was born 18 months after the wedding. She was small and alert and had Marcus's dark hair and my mother's eyes. And from the moment I held her in the delivery room at Ohio Health Riverside, something in me reorganized itself permanently around her. Whatever calculations I had been making about my life up to that point shifted to accommodate a new fixed point. She was the fixed point. Everything else was movable. Marcus's relationship with his work had always been erratic. Good quarters followed by long, flat stretches. Performance warnings followed by recoveries that lasted just long enough to forestall real consequences. But after Lily was born, the pattern accelerated in the wrong direction. He missed targets. He lost 2 accounts he described as political, but were, I knew from the documentation I quietly reviewed on the household laptop, a result of missed follow-up calls and a client meeting he had simply not attended. His company gave him a final warning in writing. He did not tell me about the warning. I found the email in his sent folder when I was looking for the password to our health insurance portal. I did not confront him about it immediately. I had, by this point, developed a habit of watching situations develop to their natural, clarifying point before intervening, a habit that some people might call passivity, but that I think of as patience with an operational purpose. I watched. I took over more of the household finances, quietly. I restructured our budget without calling it restructuring. I began very carefully to build a buffer, not because I knew what was coming, but because I understood that systems under stress tend to fail suddenly rather than gradually, and that the people who survive sudden failures are the ones who maintained the buffer before they needed it. By the time Lily was 2, I had been promoted to Director of Financial Operations at the consulting firm, which came with a salary of $94,000 a year, a title that appeared on no social media I maintained, and a level of responsibility that I performed so quietly that several of my colleagues did not fully understand what I actually did until I was gone. I will explain that more shortly.
Marcus, in this same period, had been let go from his pharmaceutical job, had spent 4 months consulting, which generated approximately $6,000 in income, and had then joined a startup selling AI-powered wellness software to corporate HR departments. The startup was 3 people and a pitch deck. He told his family it was a ground floor opportunity. He told his friends he was building something. He told me it would turn around by Q2. 3 Q2s came and went. I paid the mortgage, I paid the utilities, the car insurance, both cars, Lily's preschool, the groceries, the health insurance, the vet bills for the dog Marcus had adopted without asking me and then lost interest in within 6 weeks. I paid for the anniversary dinner at the Pearl in Grandview Heights, where Marcus told his friend Trevor that he and his wife had a good partnership, a phrase that has aged, I think, quite interestingly in retrospect. I paid for the family vacation to Hilton Head that Marcus described on his Instagram as some much-needed R&R with my girls. I did not have an Instagram. I had a spreadsheet. I am not telling you this to establish that I was a martyr, because I was not one, and I find the performance of martyrdom as exhausting as the experience of it. I am telling you because it is the essential architecture of what happens next. You cannot understand the ending without understanding the structure. The structure was this. Marcus believed he was a man temporarily between successes, married to a woman who was a competent but unremarkable support figure, living a life that would eventually, with a little luck and the right break, become the life he was supposed to have. I was in his private accounting the ballast, useful, functional, not the point.
He had a group of friends, his college roommates mostly, who had dispersed to Columbus, Cincinnati, and one to Phoenix, who shared a group text he thought I didn't know about, and a set of views about marriage and ambition that would have been recognizable to a 1950s guidance counselor. His best friend Craig, who managed a car dealership in Westerville and coached his son's travel baseball team with an intensity that suggested the team's performance was somehow cosmically connected to Craig's own self-worth, had a particular philosophy about what wives were for, and while Marcus never expressed it in quite those terms to me directly, it seeped through in other ways. The way he described my job at family dinners as accounting stuff, the way he accepted compliments about Lily's verbal development as if he had been the architect of it, the way he looked at me sometimes, across a room full of people we both knew, with the particular blankness of a man who has stopped noticing furniture. I noticed his noticing. I always notice. Gerald Weston retired from the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction in my 28th year and moved with his wife, Patricia, to Scottsdale, Arizona, where his daughter lived and where the climate was better for his knees. We had stayed in contact over the years in the intermittent, considered way of people who respect each other without requiring constant reinforcement of that respect. A card at Christmas, an email when something significant happened. He knew about my career trajectory. I had kept him updated because he had asked me to, plainly, at my release, saying, "I want to know where you end up, not because I need to, but because I'd like to." He knew about Marcus. He knew about Lily. He sent her a stuffed owl when she was born with a card that said, "For a child of her mother, this seems appropriate." I still have the card. When he moved to Scottsdale, our contact became slightly more regular, in the way that retirement sometimes frees people from the professional caution that had previously mediated their relationships. He called occasionally. He had opinions about the news. He was not a man who wasted words, which meant that when he said something, it was worth attending to. In the fall before everything happened, he called to tell me that Patricia had been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's, and I listened for an hour, and at the end of it he said quietly, "I'm glad I know someone I can say the real things to." I said, "I'm glad it's me." We hung up. I sat in the parking garage outside my office for several minutes before I started the car. I am telling you about Gerald because you need to understand who he was to me before you understand what Marcus decided to do with the information about who he was. But we are not at that part yet. We are still in the part where the walls are intact and nobody knows yet that the structure is about to fail. The photograph was taken on a Tuesday afternoon in October of my second month at Marysville. A staff member had been doing documentation photos for a facility newsletter, something about the GED program expansion, and I had been photographed in the hallway outside the classroom. I was in my uniform. I was 20. I looked, I think, like someone who was working very hard to appear calm and mostly succeeded. The photo never ran in the newsletter, but a print had been made, and somehow, through a chain of custody I have never fully reconstructed, it had found its way into a small envelope in a shoebox of old documents that I kept in the back of our closet. The shoebox contained my expungement paperwork, some letters from my mother, a birthday card from Gerald from my 25th birthday, and that photograph. I had never hidden the shoebox. It was simply in the back of a closet, in a house that was legally half mine, containing documents from a chapter of my life that was sealed by law and closed by choice. Marcus found it on a Sunday afternoon in February when I was at the grocery store with Lily. I know the exact sequence of events because our house had a security camera in the entryway, installed 18 months earlier after a car break-in on our street, and I had access to the app. I did not check it that day. I checked it the following day when I was trying to understand why Marcus had been so strange at dinner, quiet in a way that was different from his usual distracted quiet, watchful in a way that made something in my autonomic nervous system go very still. I opened the app, I scrubbed through the afternoon footage, I watched my husband walk into the frame carrying the shoebox, sit down on the entryway bench, go through the contents slowly and with focused attention, hold up the photograph for a long time, and then put everything back, replace the lid, and carry it back down the hall toward the closet. I watched this footage alone in my car in the parking garage at 11:17 on a Monday morning. Then I closed the app and sat there for a few minutes, listening to the sound of the garage, the faint hum of fluorescent lights, a car starting on the level below. I thought about the photograph. I thought about what Marcus had seen in it and what he would decide it meant. I thought about the nature of information in the hands of someone who does not understand the context that makes information legible. And then I picked up my phone and made a series of calls that I will describe to you in detail in a moment, because those calls matter enormously to what comes later. I called my attorney first. Her name is Sandra Park, and she had handled my expungement years earlier and had since become, through a series of professional interactions that had gradually shaded into friendship, the person I trusted most with anything that involved both legal and strategic dimensions. I told her what I had seen on the camera. I told her what was in the shoebox. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "How long do you think you have?" I said, "I thought a few days, maybe less." She said, "Then we need to move on a few things." I said, "I know, I've already started a list." She said, "Of course you have." There was a warmth in the way she said it that I appreciated. Then we got to work. The next call was to my bank. Not the joint account, the personal account I had maintained with absolute propriety and full legal transparency since before we were married, into which a portion of my direct deposit had always been routed, which Marcus knew about in the abstract sense that it had been disclosed on our financial documents when we bought the house, and which he had never once asked about in 7 years of marriage because it did not occur to him to be curious about money I managed. I will say this clearly. What I had in that account was mine. It had always been mine. It was the buffer I had built starting from the day I understood that systems under stress tend to fail suddenly rather than gradually. The third call was to Gerald Weston in Scottsdale. It was 11:45 in the morning Ohio time, which made it 9:45 his time, and he picked up on the second ring, which he almost always did. I told him what was happening in 2 sentences, because Gerald and I had always communicated efficiently. There was a pause. Then he said, "What do you need?" I told him. He said, "Done." Another pause. "Rachel." I said, "Yes." He said, "You are not what that photograph says you are." I said, "I know." He said, "Good. Act accordingly." We hung up. I drove back to the office. Marcus waited 3 more days. I found this interesting in a clinical way. The waiting suggested he was building something, constructing a version of events that would give him the rhetorical high ground he needed, perhaps consulting someone, Craig most likely, about how to handle what he'd found. I spent those 3 days in a surface normality that required very little effort, because surface normality was something I had learned to maintain under conditions that Marcus's brewing confrontation look, in comparative terms, like mild weather. I made dinner. I gave Lily her bath. I read her 3 chapters of her current book, a story about a girl who could talk to horses, which Lily found endlessly fascinating. I went to work. I completed 2 client reports that were due by end of week. I did not cry, not because I didn't feel anything. I felt quite a great deal, in the muffled, pressurized way of someone who has learned to process emotion on a delayed schedule, but because crying required a private space and a specific quantity of time, and I had not yet identified when those would be available. On Wednesday evening, Marcus put Lily to bed himself, which he almost never did, and which told me that the conversation was coming that night. I poured myself a glass of water, not wine, water, because I wanted to be completely clear, and sat at the kitchen table and waited. He came downstairs. He sat down across from me. He put the photograph on the table between us, face up, and said nothing for a moment, looking at it rather than at me, the way people look at evidence rather than at the person the evidence concerns. "I found this," he said. His voice was controlled in the particular way of someone who has rehearsed the opening line. I looked at the photograph. I looked at him. I said nothing. "In the shoebox in our closet," he said. "In your expungement paperwork." He said the word expungement the way people say a word they've looked up recently and are not entirely confident they're pronouncing correctly. "I know what you found," I said. My voice was level. Outside, a truck went by on the street. The refrigerator hummed. "You were in prison," he said. Not a question. "For 14 months, I said, "when I was 20, for a first-time nonviolent drug transport offense that was later expunged from my record under Ohio law. I told you about this on our 3rd date in the restaurant on Broad Street. You were wearing a blue jacket. You took my hand and told me you were grateful I trusted you." Something moved across his face. It was not guilt exactly. It was the expression of a man who has discovered that the narrative he has been preparing for does not quite fit the situation he has found himself in. He had been expecting denial or tears or the defensive scramble of someone caught hiding something. He had not been expecting precision. "That was different," he said. "You made it sound like a minor thing. This," he gestured at the photograph, "this is a mugshot. You were in prison, Rachel, an actual prison." "It was a correctional facility," I said, "and it was a facility photograph taken for an internal newsletter, not a mugshot. A mugshot is taken at booking. This was taken 14 months into my sentence. There's a meaningful difference, though I understand you may not be familiar with the distinction." His jaw tightened. He had not expected to be corrected. "The point," he said, "is that you lied to me." "About what specifically?" I said. "Name the lie, give me the date, the words, the context, because I told you on our 3rd date and again before our engagement, and I offered to provide documentation at that time, which you declined. So I would like to know specifically what lie you are referring to." He stood up. This was the moment when things became less rehearsed and the conversation began to be driven by something rawer and less controlled. He was angry in the way that people become angry when they realize the argument is not going the way they intended, and the anger was looking for a shape. "You should have told me more," he said. "You should have been more upfront about what that means, about what kind of person—" He stopped, but the end of the sentence was present in the room anyway. I looked at him. I was very still. Something had happened in my chest, not a collapse, more like a tightening, a closing. The way a door closes on a cold night when someone finally shuts it properly. I thought, there it is. There is the thing he has been building toward, the shape his anger needed. What kind of person? "Say it," I said quietly. "Finish the sentence." He didn't. Instead, he said something worse. "My mother knew something was off about you. Craig always said there was something you were hiding. I defended you. Do you understand that? I defended you to the people who matter to me, and you made me look like an idiot." I sat with that for a moment. Craig who had never held a job longer than 4 years. Craig whose first wife had left him for reasons that Craig attributed entirely to her character and that everyone else attributed almost entirely to his.
Craig's assessment of my character was one I had learned to receive with the same equanimity I applied to most information of limited analytical value. "I see," I said. I gathered my glass and stood up. "I'm going to sleep. We can discuss custody arrangements, asset division, and the mortgage in the morning, or you can have your attorney contact Sandra Park, who has been my attorney since 2014. Her contact information is on file." I don't know what he expected at that point. Probably not that. He said, in a voice that had moved from anger into something almost bewildered, "Custody? Rachel, I'm not talking about divorce. I'm talking about—" And then he stopped, as if the word he needed hadn't arrived yet. He said, "I need you to explain yourself." I paused at the kitchen doorway. I turned back and looked at him, standing in our kitchen under the lights I had chosen, beside the table I had chosen, in the house my salary paid for, holding a photograph of me at 20 in a hallway I had survived and walked out of and never looked back at. "I explained myself on our third date," I said. "I won't be doing it again." I went upstairs. I lay in the dark in the guest room. I had begun sleeping in the guest room 2 nights earlier, as a form of logistical preparation more than emotional statement, and I stared at the ceiling, and I thought with the slow, methodical clarity that extreme situations sometimes produce in me about everything I needed to do in the next 72 hours. The list was not short, but it was manageable. It was in fact already mostly done. The shoebox went with me when I left. So did everything else that was mine. My husband threw me out on a Thursday. By Saturday morning, he had already begun to understand, in the dim, incremental way that certain kinds of men understand things that contradict their assumptions, that something was wrong. Not wrong in the way he had decided things were wrong on Wednesday night, when he sat across from me at the kitchen table with that photograph and the borrowed confidence of Craig's opinions. Wrong in a different, more structural way. The kind of wrong that doesn't announce itself with a scene, the kind that you notice first as an absence, a faint silence where there used to be background noise you had stopped registering as noise at all. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about Thursday night first. I had packed the bag 3 days earlier. Not everything, just what was essential, what was mine beyond any reasonable dispute, and what I would need to function for the first 2 weeks while the larger logistics resolved themselves. 2 changes of professional clothes, my laptop, the external hard drive that contained 7 years of our household financial records, which I had been maintaining in my own organizational system since the year we bought the house, and which contained information that Sandra Park had described when I outlined the contents to her on Monday as extremely thorough. Lily's favorite stuffed animal, a faded rabbit named Bun, who had been with her since she was 8 months old, and whose absence she would have felt more acutely than almost anything else in the material world, Lily's asthma inhaler, her pediatrician's after-hours number, and 3 days of her preferred snacks, because a 4-year-old in an unfamiliar environment is managed first through the digestive system and then through explanation. My own documents were already at Sandra's office. I had driven them there on Tuesday morning before work, telling Marcus I had an early meeting. The documents included my original expungement order, my employment contract, my individual bank account records for the past 7 years, the deed to the house showing both names, both car titles, and a folder that Sandra had helped me prepare over the past 48 hours that she referred to with the dry precision I had come to appreciate in her as the contribution audit. The contribution audit was exactly what it sounds like. It was a document, 41 pages, single-spaced with supporting attachments, that itemized with dates and amounts and source accounts every financial contribution I had made to the household, the marriage, and Marcus's various professional endeavors over the course of 7 years. It was not a document I had prepared in anger.
I had been assembling the underlying data for 18 months in the quiet, unhurried way that I assembled most things, because I understood that systems under stress fail suddenly, and that the people who survive sudden failures are the people who maintained the records before they needed them. Marcus said what he said. I went upstairs. I lay in the dark in the guest room, listening to the house settle and to Lily's breathing through the baby monitor I had kept on the nightstand since she was born, even though she was 4 and didn't strictly need it anymore, because the sound of her breathing while she slept was one of the few things that reliably produced in me a sensation I can only describe as the opposite of dread. At 2 in the morning, I was still awake. I was not, however, distressed in the way that people imagine when they picture a woman lying awake at 2 in the morning the night before her marriage ends. I was running through the sequence, checking the logic, making sure I hadn't missed a step. I had not missed a step. At 6:15, before Lily woke up, I went quietly back to our bedroom and got the shoebox from the closet. Marcus was asleep. He slept on his back, mouth slightly open, the way that he always did, the way that had once seemed to me like a kind of unguarded honesty, and now seemed to be a different kind of unawareness. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom for a moment, not out of sentimentality, or not only out of sentimentality. It is hard to spend 7 years with a person and feel nothing at the end of it, even when the end is correct. But it was because I wanted to look at the room one more time while it still held both of us in it. Then I took the shoebox and went downstairs and made coffee. Lily woke up at 7, which was her usual time, and came downstairs in her elephant pajamas with her hair in the particular state of beautiful disorder that children achieve in sleep. And she climbed into my lap at the kitchen table and said, "Mama, is today a school day?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Is Daddy coming to school pickup?" I said I wasn't sure about today. She seemed to accept this. She asked for her cereal. I got it. We sat together at the kitchen table while the morning came in through the east-facing kitchen window, pale and cold and very clear, the kind of February light that has no warmth to offer but at least doesn't pretend otherwise. I held her while she ate. I was very aware of the weight of her against my chest. Marcus came down at 8:30. He had slept later than usual, which told me something about the kind of night he'd had. He stood in the kitchen doorway in a way that suggested he had things he intended to say and wasn't sure of the order anymore. Lily said, "Hi, Daddy." He said, "Hey, Bug," with the automatic tenderness that was, I think, the most genuine thing about him. Because whatever else was true, he loved her. I don't contest that. I never have. Love is not the same as fitness, and his love for her was real, even when his capacity to show up for the practical requirements of her life was not. But the love was real, and I want to say so. He looked at me. I was standing at the counter with my coffee cup. I was dressed for work. I had my bag, the packed one, not my usual work bag, by the back door, which he hadn't noticed yet. "We need to finish the conversation," he said. "Lily is here," I said. "Tonight, then." "I'll be at my sister's tonight," I said. This was true. My sister Karen lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in Worthington, had been aware of the situation since Monday evening, and had already cleared the 2nd bedroom for Lily and me with a thoroughness that told me she had been waiting for this call for longer than I had been making it. "Lily will be with me." He took this in. "You're leaving?" "I'm giving us space to have a practical conversation about what happens next without having it in front of our daughter," I said. "Sandra's office has my number. You should have your attorney contact her this week." "Rachel," he said, and his voice had changed. Some of the architecture of Wednesday night's anger had shifted. Something less certain had come in to replace it. "Rachel, I didn't say I wanted a divorce. I said I was upset. I said I needed—" "I know what you said," I said. I picked up my bag. I squatted down in front of Lily and zipped up her fleece and told her we were going to Aunt Karen's for a sleepover, which caused an expression of uncomplicated delight to cross her face that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. I helped her with her backpack. She ran to Marcus and hugged his knees and said, "Bye, Daddy." He hugged her.
Over her head, he looked at me with an expression I had not seen him before. Not anger, not defensiveness, but something closer to the beginning of understanding, which is often indistinguishable in its early stages from fear. "This isn't necessary," he said. "Whatever you think I meant—" I straightened up. I looked at him. I said, quietly and without any particular emphasis, the one thing I had prepared for this moment, the sentence I had chosen because it was precise and complete and required no follow-up. "You told me what kind of person you think I am. I heard you." I picked up Lily's hand. "I'll be in touch through Sandra." I walked us out the back door and into the cold February morning, and I put Lily in her car seat, and I drove away from the house on Thornberry Lane where I had lived for 5 years, and I did not look in the rearview mirror. Not because it didn't hurt. It did. The hurt was a physical thing, a pressure behind the sternum that had been there since Wednesday night and that I had been breathing around for 3 days. But I had discovered in the years between Marysville and the kitchen table that pain and function were not mutually exclusive. You could carry one while performing the other. You simply had to be willing to let pain be what it was, a sensation, not a verdict, and keep moving.
I called Gerald from the car while Lily slept in the back seat. It was not quite 9 in the morning Ohio time, which made it just after 7 in Scottsdale. He picked up on the second ring. "How did it go?" he said. "As expected," I said. "I'm on my way to Karen's." "Good." A pause. "How's the little one?" "Asleep. She thinks it's an adventure." "Children are resilient when their primary caregiver is calm," he said. This was a sentence that, in a different mouth, might have sounded like a platitude. From Gerald, it sounded like a field report. "How are you?" I thought about this for a moment with the honesty that Gerald had always required of me, and that I'd always found easier with him than with most people, because he received honesty without flinching and without performing sympathy, which I found more restful than actual sympathy. "I'm intact," I said. "I'm operational." "Good," he said again. "Call me tonight." We hung up. I drove north on 315 toward Worthington with the heater on and Lily breathing in the back seat and the February fields gray on both sides of the highway, and I thought, this is the start of the part where everything gets worse before it gets better. I was not wrong. Karen met us at the door with coffee for me and a plate of the particular crackers Lily liked, which she had bought specifically, because Karen had a gift for practical love that our mother had never managed. She is 2 years older than me, rounder and louder and more immediately readable than I am, and she pulled me into a hug the moment Lily had run ahead into the apartment, a hug that was brief and fierce and contained, wordlessly, everything she knew about where I had been and how I had gotten here. She said, "I've got the pull-out made up. Bathroom's cleared. There's wine after bedtime." I said, "Thank you." She said, "Don't thank me. Tell me what you need." What I needed that first week was a base of operations, which is what Karen's apartment became. I worked from her kitchen table while Lily was at preschool. The school was close enough that Karen could do pickup on the days I had back-to-back meetings, and I worked in the evenings after Lily was asleep at the fold-out table Karen had set up in the second bedroom. I was, in the surface sense, continuing to function at exactly my normal professional capacity. My team at the firm knew only that I was temporarily working remotely due to a family situation. I had sent one email to that effect on Thursday afternoon, from the car. 3 sentences, no details. My colleagues were accustomed to my operational self-sufficiency. The email caused no comment. What my team did not know, what my employer did not know, what Marcus did not know, was that I had spent the past 3 weeks, before any of this, starting from the day I had reviewed the security camera footage and understood what was coming, quietly executing a series of professional decisions that would become, in retrospect, the most consequential moves I made in that period. The first was that I had taken a call I had been putting off for 4 months, a call from a headhunter named David Okonkwo, who worked for a regional financial services firm headquartered in Cincinnati, and I had allowed the conversation to become serious. The position being discussed was VP of Operations, a step up from my current director title, at a firm that had roughly 3 times the revenue of my current employer. The salary being discussed was $140,000 a year plus equity participation. I had not told Marcus about the call. I had not told anyone. I had simply taken the calls, provided the documentation they requested, and waited. On the Friday after I left the house, David Okonkwo sent me an offer letter. I read it 3 times at Karen's kitchen table, with my coffee going cold beside me and the sounds of the apartment complex coming in through the window, someone's dog, a car starting, a child somewhere above us, and then I set the letter down on the table and I sat very still for a moment, with the specific quality of stillness that arrives sometimes when something you have been working toward actually arrives, and the arrival is more real and more quiet than the work that preceded it. Then I picked up the phone and called Sandra. "The offer came through," I said. "How is it?" "It's good. It's very good." "Then we file this week," she said, "before he files. We want to be plaintiff." "Yes," I said. "I need you to do one more thing." A pause. "I need the access codes for the joint accounts so we can document the current balances before any withdrawals occur. Your financial planner should also flag the retirement accounts." "Already done," I said. "I sent you the documentation this morning." There was a brief silence. Sandra had been my attorney for 11 years, and she had developed over those years a particular quality of silence that meant she was deciding whether to say something she wasn't sure she needed to say. I had learned to wait through these silences. "You know," she said finally, "most clients come to me after the crisis hits. You came to me before it hit." "I work with financial systems," I said. "Systems fail in predictable patterns. You learn to watch for the indicators." "Your husband," she said carefully, "seems to be under the impression that he had the leverage in this situation." "He was operating on incomplete information," I said. "That will change." It changed faster than I expected. It started, as these things often do, not with the dramatic things, but with the small ones. The quiet background functions of a household that operate so continuously and so invisibly that you only notice them when they stop. On Saturday, 2 days after I left, Marcus discovered that the password to our health insurance portal had changed. This was because I had, as part of the account audit Sandra had recommended, changed the administrative email on the joint health insurance plan to my personal address, pending the formal separation documentation that would require us to establish separate plans. I sent Marcus an email from Sandra's office address, informing him of this and providing the number for the insurance company's customer service line. The email was 2 sentences and entirely polite. I know he received it because Sandra's office uses read receipt tracking. He opened it at 11:47 on Saturday morning. He did not respond. On Sunday, he called me, not from his cell phone, from the landline in the house, which we had kept for some reason neither of us had ever examined. Inertia, probably. The way you keep things you've stopped thinking about. The landline showed on my cell phone with the area code and exchange that I associated entirely with the house on Thornberry Lane, and I looked at it for the 3 seconds it takes to make a decision, and then I declined the call. He called again 20 minutes later from his cell. I declined that one too. He sent a text that said, "Rachel, I think we need to talk about some logistics." The word logistics had the quality of a word chosen carefully, substituted for something more urgent. I did not respond. On Monday morning, he called the joint credit card company, apparently with the intention of making some change to the account, and discovered that Sandra had placed a legal hold on the account as part of the separation proceedings we had filed on Friday. He found this out from the credit card company's customer service representative, which was not, I would imagine, a conversation that went entirely according to his expectations. He called Sandra's office at 9:45. Sandra's paralegal, a calm and experienced woman named Therese, who had been with Sandra for 15 years and had developed a manner so professionally serene that it functioned almost as a form of mild psychological warfare, informed him that all communication regarding the Donovan separation should be directed through his attorney of record, and that Miss Park would be happy to correspond with that attorney at his earliest convenience, and could she take a message. Marcus did not leave a message. He texted me at 10:15. The text said, "What the hell is happening with the credit card?" I read it while sitting at Karen's kitchen table with my second coffee and a client report I was revising, and I experienced, for just a moment, something I am going to describe as accurately as I can. A very faint, very precise satisfaction that had nothing to do with cruelty and everything to do with the particular relief of a sequence executing correctly. I had not done these things out of spite. I had done them because they were the logical, legally appropriate steps that Sandra and I had mapped out, and the map was accurate. The sequence was working. I did not respond to the text. He called Craig that afternoon. I know this because Craig's wife, Michelle, who had a complicated and somewhat exhausted relationship with Craig's certainties, a relationship I had observed over years of Thanksgiving dinners and 4th of July cookouts, and had found quietly legible in the way of things nobody says directly, sent me a text at 3:17 that said simply, "Craig says Marcus called him. I'm sorry this is happening. Let me know if Lily needs anything." I responded to Michelle. I thanked her. I noted with a small and non-performative interest that she had texted me, not Marcus. The pattern of the next 10 days was this. Marcus would encounter an absence, a missing access, a changed account, a service that was no longer automatic, and he would go through a sequence that I came to understand quite well from the external evidence of his texts and calls, a sequence that ran roughly from confusion to frustration to a specific kind of baffled anger that is the anger of someone who has not until this moment understood how many things were simply handled invisibly by a person they had ceased to pay close attention to. The utilities were in my name, all of them. This was not deliberate maneuvering on my part. It was simply how they had been set up when we bought the house, because I was the one who had handled the setup, and it had never been changed because it had never been a problem, because I had always paid them. On the 9th day after I left, the gas bill came due. It had been on auto-pay from the joint account, which was now in legal hold. The auto-pay failed. The gas company sent a notice. Marcus called me, and this time I picked up because Sandra had advised me to be responsive on practical household matters for the sake of the ongoing proceedings, and because I had no desire to make his life difficult in ways that were beneath the actual stakes of the situation. "The gas is going to get shut off," he said. His voice was not angry exactly. It had moved past anger into something more stripped down, more exposed. He sounded, for the first time in recent memory, like a man who was not performing anything. "Yes," I said. "The auto-pay was through the joint account. You'll need to call and establish a new payment method directly. I can text you the account number."
A pause. You knew this was going to happen. "I knew the auto-pays would be affected by the hold," I said. "Sandra sent your attorney a list of the utilities and accounts that would need to be transferred. Did you get an attorney?" Another pause. Longer. "Not yet." "Marcus," I said, and I said it without sharpness, because sharpness was not what the moment required, and because I was not, whatever else I was, a person who kicked things that were already on the ground. You need an attorney. This is not a situation you should be navigating without one. I can text you the gas account number right now, and I'd encourage you to address the utilities this week." "Right," he said. "Yeah. Then, Rachel, can we sit down, the two of us, without attorneys, and actually talk?" "We can talk through Sandra and your attorney," I said. "That's the appropriate channel right now." "That's not—" He stopped. I could hear him breathing. I heard in the background the particular sound of the house, the hum of the refrigerator, a sound I knew so well I could have identified it in a recording. "I just want to understand what's happening." "What's happening," I said, "is that I'm taking the steps that Sandra has advised me to take, which are standard in a separation proceeding. Nothing that's happening is out of the ordinary. It just may feel that way because you weren't paying attention to how the ordinary things worked." I sent him the gas account number after we hung up. I also sent him the electric, the water, and the internet, along with the name of the customer service contact at the internet company who had been helpful when we'd had the outage 2 winters ago. Sandra would probably have suggested I not include the extra information. on the grounds that it was not strictly necessary, and that unnecessary helpfulness in an adversarial proceeding can be misread. But I included it because it was accurate, and because it would allow him to function, and my goal was never to make him unable to function. My goal was much more precise than that. He found an attorney on day 11. His name was Raymond Buell, and he had an office on East Broad Street, and a reputation, Sandra told me when she called to say she'd received his retainer letter, as someone who was aggressive in the opening stages of cases, and then generally settled when the documentation made aggression unsustainable. Which means, Sandra said, with the particular dry warmth she reserved for moments like this, we should be thorough. I said, when have we not been? She said, fair. We went over the contribution audit together for the second time, line by line, and Sandra added 3 exhibits she said would be useful. The audit was now 47 pages. Raymond Buell's first communication, 2 days later, was a letter asserting that Marcus was contesting the terms of the separation filing and requesting a discovery period of 30 days for financial documentation. This was standard. Sandra responded the same day with a document packet that included the contribution audit, 7 years of bank statements, the household expense records, Marcus's employment history as it related to household income, and a cover letter that Sandra had written in the precise, measured, utterly devastating language that was her particular gift, and that stated in the clearest possible terms that my client had maintained comprehensive records of all financial contributions to the marital household and was prepared to support those records in any proceeding the opposing party elected to pursue.
Raymond Buell called Sandra the following day. The call lasted 40 minutes. Sandra called me afterward. He wanted to discuss settlement, she said. Already? His client has reviewed the audit, she said. He apparently had several questions about the numbers. A pause. Specifically about the discrepancy between your contributions and his. What did you tell him? I told him the numbers were accurate and fully documented, she said. I also told him that my client's new employment, which begins in 6 weeks, was not relevant to the settlement calculation since it postdated the filing and therefore did not constitute marital income. He had not considered that. No, I said, he wouldn't have. Sandra said, Rachel, he didn't know about the job offer, did he? I knew I was employed, I said. He didn't know the details. A brief silence. You prepared for this very thoroughly. I work with systems, I said. I told you, systems fail in predictable patterns. Marcus asked to see Lily on day 12. I said yes, immediately and without conditions, because whatever else was happening, she was his daughter, and he loved her, and she loved him, and inserting her into the mechanics of the separation was something I had decided from the beginning I would not do. We arranged an afternoon at the house. His house, technically, our house, legally, the division to be determined. Karen dropped Lily off. Marcus's mother was there when they arrived, which Karen texted to tell me about, and which I noted without surprise. Marcus's mother, Donna, was a woman who organized her responses to difficult situations around the axis of what reflected best on her son, a tendency I had observed over 7 years and had long since stopped taking personally. The visit went fine. Lily reported at bedtime that she had had macaroni and cheese and watched a movie, and that Daddy seemed tired. 4-year-olds are, in their observations of adults, frequently more accurate than the adults themselves. On day 14, I drove back to the house for the first time with Karen in the passenger seat and Sandra's list on my phone to collect the rest of my personal belongings. Marcus was not home. We had coordinated this through the attorneys, specifically to avoid a scene, which both Sandra and Raymond Buell had recommended, and which I had agreed to with the efficiency of someone who had no interest in scenes on principle. Marcus's absence from the house while I was in it was one of the few things we had agreed on easily, which told me something about what we both understood the stakes of our presence in the same room to be. The house felt, when I walked in through the back door, like a house in which someone had stopped maintaining something they hadn't realized they were maintaining.
This is difficult to describe precisely, but it was there in the details. Dishes in the drying rack that had been washed but not put away, a pile of mail on the counter that included 2 pieces I could tell from the envelopes were bills requiring attention, the dog's water bowl sitting empty by the back door. The dog himself, Percy, the lab mix Marcus had adopted in a burst of enthusiasm 18 months earlier, and had since related to in the distant, benevolent manner of a landowner visiting his estate, came and leaned against my leg the moment I walked in, tail working slowly. I stood still for a moment and let him lean. Karen pretended to be looking at her phone.
I went through the house methodically. I took my clothes, my books, my professional files, the contents of the desk in the study that was technically a shared space but had in practice been entirely mine for 4 years. I took the photo albums that predated Marcus, my childhood, my 20s, the years at Marysville that I had documented in the way that survivors sometimes document things, not to commemorate but to confirm that they had actually happened. I left everything that was shared or ambiguous. I left the furniture, the art we'd chosen together, the kitchen items, everything in Lily's room exactly as it was. Her room was her room, and nothing in it was being touched by either party until the logistics were settled. We had agreed on this without needing Sandra to broker it. I left the dog, which was a practical decision I made with the specific sorrow of a person who had not chosen the dog and then loved it anyway. At the door on my way out, Karen beside me with 2 boxes, I paused and looked back at the entryway. The bench where Marcus had sat with the shoebox, the coat hooks where Lily's winter coats were still hanging, 3 of them at different sizes, a record of her growth in outerwear, the particular slant of afternoon light through the sidelight windows that I had always liked, that I had thought about on winter mornings when everything was gray and this one angle of light was warm. I let myself look at it for exactly as long as I needed to. Then I picked up my box and walked out. Day 16 was when the startup Marcus worked for went quiet in the specific way that startups go quiet when the runway runs out. I know this because David Nair, the lead founder, who I had met twice at company events and who had struck me both times as genuinely talented but chronically undercapitalized, sent a company-wide email announcing that due to current market conditions, the company was pausing operations and exploring strategic options, which is the language that startup founders use when they mean the money is gone. Marcus's salary, $1,100 a week, the only income he had been generating, stopped. His company laptop sent an automated deregistration notification to the IT systems, which Marcus had listed me as the account backup for, and I received the notification on my phone as a push alert while I was in the middle of a client call. I noted it. I said nothing about it on the call. After the call, I forwarded the notification to Sandra with a single line, "For the record." Sandra filed an amended income disclosure the following day. I want to tell you about day 18, because day 18 was when Marcus showed up at Karen's apartment unannounced at 7:30 in the evening. Lily was in the bath. Karen opened the door. I heard his voice from the hallway, and I came to the doorway of the bedroom and stood there, not blocking anything, not performing anything, just present. He looked worse than I had seen him in years. Not dramatically worse, he was dressed and shaved and looked, from a distance, like himself, but there were details that told a different story. The quality of his eyes, something slightly unmoored in them, the way he was standing, with less of the automatic physical confidence that had always been one of his more readable characteristics, the faint roughness of his voice when he said Karen's name and asked if he could come in. Karen looked at me. I gave her the smallest nod.
He sat on Karen's couch. Karen made herself scarce in the kitchen with the excessive casualness of a person trying not to be obvious about being tactful. I sat in the armchair across from him. Between us was Karen's coffee table, which held a library book Lily had been looking at, and a half-finished mug of chamomile tea that was mine. "I'm losing the house," Marcus said. I said nothing. Without the startup salary, and without... He stopped. Started again. "The mortgage payment is due in 12 days. I can't make it on my own." "Raymond Buell can file for a temporary maintenance order," I said, "if you need emergency financial support during the separation period. That's a standard mechanism." I don't want a court order, Rachel. His voice was effortful in a specific way. I want to have a conversation like two adults who have a child together. We are having that conversation, I said, and I'm telling you the legal instrument that exists for exactly this situation. You planned this, he said. It was not quite an accusation. It was something closer to a realization arriving in real time, the particular note of a man hearing an answer to a question he's been trying not to ask. You had everything arranged before you left, the attorney, the accounts, the job. I prepared for a situation that appeared likely, I said. Yes. How long had you been preparing? I looked at him. Long enough. He sat with that for a moment. The apartment was quiet except for the sound of the bath running in the hallway and Lily's voice, faint and happy, narrating something to herself the way she always did in the bath, a continuous, almost song-like narration about whatever scenario her imagination had constructed. We could both hear her. I saw it register in his face. I said something terrible, he said. What kind of person? Yes, I said. You did. I was angry. I wasn't thinking. I had Craig telling me for years that something was off about you, and then I found the picture and everything he'd said just sort of... He made a gesture, vague, a gesture that tried to encompass the psychology of a man who had outsourced his perceptions to someone he trusted more than his own experience. I let him in my head, and I took it out on you. You did, I said. I want to fix it, he said. I want to come back from this.
I sat with what he'd said. I let it exist in the room without filling the space around it immediately, which is a technique I had learned not from a therapist or a book, but from Gerald Weston, who had been the first person I'd encountered who understood that silence in a conversation was not a gap to be filled, but a condition to be maintained until something true could be said into it. I thought about the photograph. I thought about the sentence he hadn't finished. What kind of person? And the way it had been present in the room anyway, the way unsaid things are often more present than the things that are said. I thought about 7 years. I thought about Lily in the bath, narrating her imaginary world with the focused, joyful intensity of someone who has not yet learned that the world requires negotiation. Marcus, I said, I need you to hear something, and I need you to really hear it, not respond to it, just hear it. Can you do that? He nodded. I spent 7 years being the structure of this family, I said. The financial structure, the logistical structure, the emotional structure. I paid the mortgage and the utilities and the insurance and the school and the groceries and the vacations. I covered for your gaps without mentioning them because I thought that was what love asked for. I built a buffer because I understood that systems fail suddenly, and I wanted there to be something standing when the failure came. And then you found a photograph from before we met, from the worst year of my life, a year I survived and walked out of and told you about on our 3rd date, and you decided on the basis of that photograph and Craig's opinions that you knew what kind of person I was. I paused. That's what I can't come back from, not the words. The decision behind the words, the version of me you were willing to believe when someone offered it to you. He was very still. His hands were in his lap. Outside, somewhere on Karen Street, a car went by with music playing, briefly loud and then gone. I don't know how to defend myself against that, he said quietly. I'm not asking you to, I said. I'm asking you to hear it. There's a difference. He heard it, or at least he sat in the hearing of it, which is sometimes the most that's available. We talked for another 40 minutes, practically, about Lily, about the mortgage, about the timeline Sandra and Raymond had proposed. He was different in those 40 minutes than he had been at any point in the preceding weeks. Quieter, more careful, less performing of anything. I did not soften the practical facts, because the practical facts were what they were, and softening them would not have served either of us. But I also did not press any advantage beyond what the situation required, because pressing advantages was not the point. The point, the actual point, the one I had been navigating toward since Monday morning in the parking garage, was not to punish Marcus. It was to disengage, to withdraw the resource that had been sustaining a structure that no longer deserved sustaining, and to redirect it toward a structure that did.
When he left, Karen came out of the kitchen and handed me a glass of wine without saying anything. I took it. Lily came down the hall in her pajamas with her wet hair combed and her rabbit under her arm and climbed into my lap and said, "Was that Daddy?" I said yes. She said, "Is he okay?" I said he was going to be okay. She seemed to accept this. She rested her head against my collarbone, and we sat there in the small, warm light of Karen's living room, and I held her and said nothing. And the wine was very good, and somewhere in Scottsdale it was early evening, and Gerald Weston was probably sitting on his back porch watching the light on the mountains and thinking about nothing in particular, which was his preferred form of rest. And I was exactly where I needed to be, which is to say, not where I had been and not yet where I was going, but in the exact moment between the two, which is, in its own way, a place. The offer from Cincinnati became official on a Tuesday morning in March, 6 weeks after I left the house on Thornberry Lane, and I accepted it by email at 8:47, sitting at Karen's kitchen table with a second cup of coffee, and Lily's breakfast dishes still in the drying rack, and the particular quality of early March light coming through the window that is neither winter nor spring, but something transitional and honest about being neither. I read the offer letter one more time before I hit send. 140,000 base, 15% annual bonus target, equity participation beginning at year 2, full benefits including the dependent care FSA that would cover a substantial portion of whatever childcare arrangement I established in Cincinnati. I hit send. I sat for a moment. Then I washed Lily's cereal bowl and got ready for work. I had not told Marcus about Cincinnati yet. This was not concealment in any meaningful legal sense. Sandra had reviewed the situation and confirmed that accepting employment in another Ohio city during an active separation proceeding required notification to the opposing party only if it affected the parenting schedule, which it did, and which I had therefore included in the amended parenting plan we had filed the previous week, and language that was clear and specific, and had been drafted with the kind of precision that left very little room for the kind of ambiguity that generates additional legal fees. Raymond Buell had received the amended plan on Friday. It was now Tuesday. I expected to hear from him by end of day. I heard from Marcus first. At 12:30, my cell phone rang with his number, and I picked up because Sandra had advised responsiveness on practical matters, and because I had reached, in the weeks since the night at Karen's, a position of such fundamental settledness about the end of the marriage that Marcus's calls no longer required the kind of preparation they had in the early days. They were logistical now. They were the ongoing administration of a closing. "Cincinnati," he said, no preamble. "Yes," I said. "You're moving to Cincinnati?" "In 6 weeks. Lily and I will be in Cincinnati. The parenting plan addresses the schedule in detail. Raymond has it."
A pause. I could hear him processing the information, fitting it against whatever internal map he'd been maintaining of how things would develop. "This is Rachel. That's 3 hours away." 112 miles, I said. "It's a manageable drive. The parenting plan includes alternating weekends, school breaks, and 2 weeks in the summer. That's been standard in Ohio courts for interstate parenting arrangements since the guidelines were updated in 2019. Sandra checked. "I'm sure she did," he said, and there was a note in it. Not quite bitterness, more the particular dryness of someone who has spent several weeks discovering that the other party in a negotiation has been more prepared than they were. "Did you have this planned before all of this started?"
I had a conversation with a recruiter that I allowed to become serious, I said. The timing was responsive to circumstances, that's all. That's all, he repeated. Then, Craig says you engineered this whole thing. The accounts, the timing, all of it. I waited a moment before I answered. Not for dramatic effect. I had no interest in drama with Marcus, had never had any interest in it, but because the mention of Craig required a specific kind of response, the kind that was measured enough to be accurate and direct enough to be final. Craig, I said, is a man who told you for years that something was off about me, and whose assessment of my character you chose to credit over 7 years of actual evidence, and whose opinion contributed materially to the conversation that ended our marriage. I'd suggest that Craig's ongoing analysis of my motivations is not the most reliable information available to you, but that's your call to make.
A silence, longer than usual. That's fair, Marcus said. And he said it quietly enough and with enough of the stripped-down quality that I had first heard in his voice on day 9 of the gas bill that I believed he meant it. He had been, in the weeks since Karen's couch, progressively less the man who had held up the photograph and more the man who had taken my hand across a restaurant table 11 years ago and said, "Thank you for trusting me." It was too late for that man to matter in the way he would have needed to matter, but it was not nothing. I do not discard things that are not nothing. "I'll have Lily for Easter weekend," he said. "The plan shows that." "It does." "Okay." Another pause. "I hope Cincinnati is good for you, both of you." He said it like a man who has accepted a verdict and is trying to conduct himself with dignity in the accepting, which is, in the end, the most you can ask for from anyone. "I know," I said. "Goodbye, Marcus." I hung up. I sat for a moment. Then I opened my laptop and began reviewing the client file I had a meeting about in 40 minutes, and the day continued. Craig came to find me on a Saturday in late March. I say came to find me because it was clearly intentional. He showed up at Karen's building at 10 in the morning, which told me Marcus had given me the address, whether deliberately or in the unconscious way that people give information to people they are close to, without fully registering the giving. Karen buzzed me when she saw him on the entry camera. I told her to let him in. She looked at me with the expression she reserved for situations where she felt concern, but had learned that expressing it would not change my course of action. She let him in. I met him in the hallway outside Karen's door, rather than inside, because inside was Lily's current space, and Craig had no business in Lily's current space. He was wearing a Buckeyes jacket and an expression that was attempting to project casual authority and achieving something closer to effortful discomfort. He was a big man, broad across the shoulders, thick through the neck, the physical architecture of someone who had played sports seriously in his 20s and maintained the silhouette without entirely maintaining the conditioning. And he stood in Karen's apartment hallway with his arms slightly away from his body the way men of a certain build sometimes do, a habit so ingrained they don't notice it. "Rachel," he said, "I was hoping we could talk." "We're talking," I said. I stayed where I was, in the doorway. "What would you like to say?" He glanced down the hallway, a reflexive scan that I think was meant to establish whether anyone else was present. There was no one. He looked back at me. He said, "I think you've been unfair to Marcus." I said nothing. I let that sit for a moment, the way you let an opening argument sit before you begin cross-examination. "He made a mistake," Craig said. "He overreacted to what he found. I'll own that I may have influenced his thinking in the moment, but what you've done since then, the accounts, the attorneys, taking Lily to Cincinnati, that's a level of retaliation that doesn't match what actually happened. Tell me," I said, "what you think actually happened." He seemed slightly surprised to be asked. He had expected, I think, either capitulation or defensiveness, and was finding that he had walked into a third thing that didn't fit either of his prepared responses. "He found something you'd been hiding," he said. "He reacted badly. You're blowing up the family over a bad reaction." "Let me be precise about what happened," I said. My voice was the same register it had been since he arrived, conversational,
not warm, not aggressive, simply level in the way that a surface is level when it has been made that way on purpose. My husband found a photograph from a period of my life that I disclosed to him in full on our third date, before we were engaged, before we were married. He chose to interpret that photograph as evidence that I had lied to him, despite having been told the truth 11 years earlier. He told me, in the course of expressing that interpretation, that I was a specific kind of person. He did not finish the sentence, but the sentence was present. You were the source of the framework he used to understand that photograph. You had been telling him for years that something was off about me. The night he found the photograph, he made a decision based on your framework rather than his own experience. That decision ended the marriage. The steps I have taken since then are legal, documented, and proportionate to a situation as it actually exists. None of them are retaliation. They are simply the natural result of a woman withdrawing a contribution that had been taken for granted. Cragg looked at me for a moment. Something was happening in his face that I found genuinely interesting from an observational standpoint. The sequence of a man encountering a version of events that is more coherent than the version he arrived with, and having to make a rapid calculation about whether to engage with it or dismiss it. He was not a stupid man. I want to be fair about that. He was a man with a specific and limited set of frameworks for understanding women, and within those frameworks he was functional, and even in certain contexts, competent. But I was outside those frameworks, and encountering me directly, without Marcus as an intermediary, was a different experience than telling Marcus what he thought of his wife over a group text. "You're very calculated," he said. He didn't say it as an insult exactly. It had the quality of an observation that was also an accusation in search of more confidence than he currently had. "I'm organized," I said. "There's a distinction. Calculation implies motive beyond the situation. Organization is a response to the situation as it exists. I organized my response to a situation that your intervention helped create. I'd suggest that the level of organization you're observing is in direct proportion to the level of disruption that was directed at me."
He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Marcus is in real trouble financially." "I know," I said. "He needs help." "He needs an income," I said. "The startup failed, which is unfortunate, but it is also the third professional venture in 7 years that has not generated a stable income. The pattern is relevant information. Raymond Buell has the financial documentation. What Marcus needs is a realistic assessment of his employment situation, which his attorney and the court can facilitate. What he does not need is for his wife, his ex-wife, to subsidize a pattern that has been ongoing for years, simply because the alternative is uncomfortable." "So you're just going to leave him to drown?" I looked at Craig directly. "I paid the mortgage on that house for 4 years," I said. "I paid the utilities, both cars, Lily's school, the groceries, the health insurance, the vacation you came on in 2023 where he described it as his treat. I paid for the anniversary dinner where he told you we had a good partnership. I was the financial infrastructure of that marriage for the majority of its duration. I did all of this while holding a professional position that Marcus described at family events as accounting stuff. When Marcus found a photograph and decided, with your guidance, that it told him something essential and damning about my character, he was making that decision about a woman who had been quietly keeping his life operational for years. The natural consequence of that decision is that the operation stops. That's not leaving him to drown, that's the water finding its natural level." Craig opened his mouth, closed it. The hallway was very quiet. Somewhere above us, someone was walking, the creak of footsteps in an apartment overhead. "I want to show you something," I said. I had prepared for this conversation, not because I had known he would come, but because I had considered it probable and had decided that if he came, I would use the opportunity. I went back into the apartment briefly and came out with a folder.
This is a summary of the contribution audit that Sandra filed with the court. It's a matter of record, so there's no confidentiality issue in my showing you. I'd like you to look at page 3. He took the folder with the slightly wary manner of a man accepting a document from someone he suspects of being better prepared than him. He opened it. He found page 3. I had flagged it. Page 3 was a summary table. On one side, Marcus's financial contributions to the household over 7 years, organized by year and category. On the other, mine. The table was not editorialized. It did not use adjectives. It simply showed 2 columns of numbers, sourced and documented, and allowed the numbers to say what numbers say when they are accurate. Craig looked at the table for what I estimated was 45 seconds, which is a long time to look at a single page in silence. Then he looked up. He didn't know it was this, he said. It was not a defense of Marcus, exactly. It was more like a man updating a model in real time. No, I said. He didn't. Why didn't you tell him? I told him what he asked about, I said. He didn't ask. There's a difference between concealment and the absence of information that no one sought. You can note that distinction when you speak to him next.
Right, so let's get right into it because we have a lot to unpack. I took the folder back. Craig stood in the hallway for another moment, in the diminished way of a man who had arrived with a position and left with something considerably less than that. He said, "I'm sorry for whatever part I played." "I know," I said. "Goodbye, Craig." I went back inside and closed the door. Karen was in the kitchen. She said, without looking up from what she was doing, "How'd that go?" I said, "Fine." She said, "I made more coffee." I said, "Thank you." Sandra called that afternoon with the news I had been expecting since Raymond Buell's call the previous week. Marcus had agreed to the terms of the settlement. The house would be listed. The proceeds, after the mortgage balance, would be split according to the contribution formula Sandra had established, which weighted each party's financial input over the life of the marriage. My share was 63%. The parenting plan, as proposed, was accepted without modification. Marcus had waived any claim to spousal support, which was straightforward given the documented income disparity. The equity in the joint retirement accounts would be split evenly, which was the one area where I had agreed to deviate from the contribution formula, not because I was required to do it, but because I had decided, on reflection, that it was the right thing to do. And I have found that doing the right thing in situations where you are not required to do it tends to produce a quality of settlement that litigation does not. "It's done," Sandra said. "Yes," I said. "How are you feeling?" I thought about this for a moment with the honesty I had always tried to bring to that question when Sandra asked it. "Resolved," I said. "Not happy, exactly. Resolved." "That's accurate," she said. "Resolved is appropriate." We talked through the timeline for another 20 minutes. The house would be listed in April, and in a market like Columbus's, Sandra estimated a closing by late May or early June. The Cincinnati position started April 14th. I had found an apartment in Hyde Park, a neighborhood on the eastern side of the city with good schools and a farmer's market on Sundays, and a particular quality of established residential calm that I had noticed on my visit, and that seemed like the right register for the next chapter. Not aspirational, not provisional, simply solid and real, and mine. I want to tell you about the day I told Gerald. It was a Sunday evening, first week of April, 3 days before I drove Lily down to Cincinnati for the first time. Karen had taken Lily to her friend's birthday party, and I was alone in the apartment for the first time in weeks, which produced a quality of silence that was neither lonely nor quite comfortable, simply unfamiliar. The silence of a space that has been full of people and now isn't. I sat by the window with my phone and called Scottsdale.
Gerald picked up on the second ring, as always. "How's the patient?" he said. This was his way of asking how I was in situations he knew had been difficult. I had never asked him to explain it. I understood it. "Ambulatory," I said, "and about to be relocated." I told him about Cincinnati, about the offer, the accept, the apartment, the school I'd found for Lily, the settlement. I talked for longer than I usually did, which Gerald allowed without interrupting, which was itself a form of attention. When I finished, there was a moment of silence that I recognized as the kind he used for processing rather than the kind he used for deciding whether to speak. "Patricia said to tell you she's proud of you," he said. "She's been following this more closely than I have, which is saying something. Tell her I said thank you. She also says," he continued, with the faint, particular dryness that I had always found more reassuring than most people's warmth, that $140,000 is a fair salary for someone of your demonstrated capabilities, and that you should negotiate harder at year 2. I'll tell my VP of everything she agrees with me. Rachel." The dryness was gone. His voice had the quality it got on the rare occasions when he said something he meant for the record, something he had decided needed to be said clearly rather than economically. "You walked into my facility when you were 20 years old, and you were the most operationally capable person I encountered in that building in 3 decades of work, not among the inmates, in the building. That has not changed. I want you to carry that with you." The apartment was very quiet. The late afternoon light was coming through Karen's window at the angle I had gotten used to over the past 2 months, a warm sideways light that touched the left side of the room and left the right in shadow, and I sat in it and let Gerald's words exist in the space around me without deflecting them or minimizing them, which is something I had learned to do rather late and with some effort, the receiving of true things without immediately converting them into something more manageable. "I hear you," I said. "Thank you, Gerald." "Good," he said. "Now tell me about the apartment. Is it on a decent street?" I told him about the apartment. He had opinions about Hyde Park based on a conference he had attended in Cincinnati in 2009, which had been held near enough to that neighborhood for him to have formed impressions of it. We talked for another half-hour. When we hung up, I sat in the quiet for a few more minutes, and then I made dinner for 1, and then Karen and Lily came home loud and happy from the birthday party, and the apartment was full again, and that was fine too. The house on Thornberry Lane sold in May, in 11 days, at $4,000 over asking, because it was a good house in a good neighborhood, and the market in Columbus was still, despite everything that had happened in the broader economy, a market that rewarded good houses in good neighborhoods. My share of the proceeds was $231,000, which arrived in my personal account on a Wednesday, and which I sat with for exactly as long as it took to drink a cup of coffee, and then I had Sandra confirm the transfer to the investment account she had helped me set up, and then I went back to work, because work was the thing in front of me, and work was good.
Marcus took a sales position with a medical device company in late April. It was a step down from where he had been in terms of territory and base salary, but it was stable in the way that pharmaceutical and medical device sales tends to be stable when someone applies himself consistently. And from what Karen told me, she had maintained a polite and essentially drama-free relationship with his sister, who gave her occasional updates. He was applying himself. He was in the house on Thornberry for 2 more weeks after the sale, staying with a colleague, and then he rented an apartment in Clintonville. Lily liked the apartment. She told me it had a porch that looked at a tree. I'm not interested in performing ambivalence about Marcus that I don't feel. The truth is more complicated and more simple at the same time. He was a man who, in one terrible and unguarded night, revealed the limits of his understanding of who I was, and those limits were incompatible with the marriage we had been building. He was also a man who had genuinely loved me in the ways available to him, and who genuinely loved our daughter with a consistency that I found, and continue to find, meaningful. These two things coexist without difficulty in my actual experience, which is not something I could have said 2 years ago. Growth is sometimes quiet and lateral and happens in the margins of larger events. Craig, for whatever it is worth, did not contact me again after the hallway. Michelle texted me occasionally, school supply recommendations, a heads up when there was a good sale on the brand of sneakers Lily liked, the careful maintenance of a connection that had survived something that had tested it. I responded to Michelle's texts. I appreciated them. The apartment in Hyde Park had 12-foot ceilings and hardwood floors that someone had refurnished recently and well, and a second bedroom for Lily that received morning light from an east-facing window. I furnished it over 3 weekends, without rushing, buying things because they were right rather than because they filled a space, and the apartment came together slowly and in a way I liked, which is to say without excess and without apology. Lily picked out a rug for her room that was the green of pine trees in summer, which I would not have chosen, and which was, objectively, exactly right. She had her rabbit, she had her books, she had her window. My first week at the new job, I arrived at the office on Madison Road 45 minutes early, because I am who I am, and I sat in the parking lot for 10 of those minutes reviewing the organizational chart and the Q1 operational report I had been sent as onboarding material. And when I walked into the building, I walked in the way I had learned to walk into rooms, without announcement, without performance, with the specific combination of attention and composure that is not confidence in the theatrical sense, but something more functional. The simple posture of someone who knows what she is doing and has earned the right to that knowledge.
My new team was 6 people. By the end of the first week, I knew each of them well enough to have a useful map of their strengths and their friction points. By the end of the second week, I had submitted my first operational efficiency memo, 12 pages focused on the reconciliation process between accounts receivable and client billing, which had a redundancy in it that was costing approximately 11 hours per week across the team. My new manager, a woman named Patricia Osei, who had a reputation in the organization for being difficult to impress, read the memo over the weekend and sent me an email on Monday morning that said, "This is excellent work. Let's meet Tuesday." I arrived at the Tuesday meeting with 3 additional exhibits I had prepared over the weekend in case they were useful. They were useful. Gerald called on my first Friday in Cincinnati at 6:15 my time, 4:15 his, which was a call time he had never used before. I picked up and said, "Is everything all right?" He said, "Fine. Patricia wanted me to call on a Friday because she said that's when people need to hear from friends." A pause. I told her I'd never made a social call on a Friday in my life. She said it wasn't a social call, it was a welfare check, and those are different. Another pause. "So, how's the week?" "The week was good," I said. "The week was genuinely good." "Good," he said, and I could hear, even across the distance, even through the phone, the particular quality of satisfaction in that word, the satisfaction of a man who had made a long-term investment and was watching it produce exactly the return he had always known it would. We talked for 45 minutes. He told me about Patricia's latest PT appointment and about the new patio furniture he had assembled that weekend, which he described with the rueful precision of someone who had assembled furniture as an exercise in humility. I told him about Lily's new school and about the farmer's market 2 blocks from our building, where I had bought tomatoes that tasted the way tomatoes are supposed to taste and almost never do. It was, in every measurable sense, an ordinary phone call between 2 people who had known each other for 12 years and maintained, across all the changes of those years, the kind of connection that does not require maintenance because it is built from something more durable than effort. I want to tell you one more thing, and then I want to ask you something. In September, 6 months after I moved to Cincinnati, I drove back to Columbus for Lily's first overnight with Marcus at his new apartment. I drove her up on a Friday afternoon and we listened to her current audiobook for most of the drive, a story about a girl who solves mysteries at her school, which Lily found endlessly satisfying. We got to Clintonville at 4:30 and Marcus was waiting outside. I noted this, the fact that he was waiting outside, which was a small thing and a not a small thing, and Lily ran to him the way children run to the people they love, without self-consciousness, without reservation, with the full available momentum of her body. He caught her, he swung her once, she laughed. He looked at me over her head. "Thanks for the drive," he said. "Do you want to come in for a minute?" "I'm good," I said. "I'll be here Sunday at 4. "Sunday at 4, he confirmed. I got back in the car. I pulled out of the parking lot onto the street and drove toward the highway. The September afternoon was the color that September afternoons in Ohio sometimes are, amber and clear, the light at an angle that makes even ordinary things look like they're worth keeping. I drove south on 71 with the windows down and the audiobook still playing because Lily had left her headphones on the back seat. And for 40 minutes, I listened to the story of a girl who solved mysteries
I thought about almost nothing, which is a thing I have gotten better at. The luxury of a mind that is not in crisis. The simple forward motion of a life that is, at last, entirely one's own. There is a thing I keep on my desk at the office. It is the birthday card Gerald sent me when I turned 25, the one that had been in the shoebox, the one I had taken when I packed. It is not framed. It sits propped against the side of my monitor, slightly faded now, the handwriting in it as precise and economical as the man who wrote it. The card says, "For a woman who understands that the longest way around is sometimes the shortest way home, G.W."
I have thought about that sentence a great deal over the past year. I think it means something different to me now than it did at 25, and something different again than it will mean at 45, which is how the best things work. They expand to meet the understanding you bring to them. What I think it means right now, sitting in my office in Cincinnati on a Thursday morning with the operational report for Q3 open on my screen and Lily's drawing of our apartment building taped to the wall beside the whiteboard and Patricia Osei's Tuesday meeting on my calendar and 7 years of a life I built and rebuilt from the materials available to me, laid out somewhere behind me like a map of terrain I have crossed and do not need to return to. What I think it means right now is this. The things that were done to you are not the definition of you. The response is the definition. The response and the patience and the willingness to understand your own value before anyone else gets around to confirming it. Because they may not, and you cannot afford to wait. Someone once told me in a gray-green hallway in Marysville, Ohio, that I should act accordingly. I have tried, in the years since, to do exactly that. The question I want to leave you with is the one I ask myself sometimes, usually on quiet mornings before the day has accumulated its weight, usually with coffee, usually when Lily is still asleep and the apartment is still, and I have a few minutes that are entirely mine. If you had been in that kitchen on that February night, if someone you loved had held up a photograph of your worst year and made a decision about your character based on it, what would you have done? Would you have tried to explain yourself one more time? Would you have stayed and fought for what you'd built? Or would you have understood, the way I eventually understood, that some arguments are not about the thing they appear to be about, and that the only response to someone telling you who they think you are is to show them, very quietly and very completely, who you actually are? Write it in the comments. I read everyone. And from my point of view, I want to be honest with you. This story was never really about Marcus, or the photograph, or even the marriage. It was about the moment when a person stops trying to be legible to the wrong audience and starts being fully, unapologetically readable only to herself. That moment is available to everyone. It doesn't require a prison sentence, or a separation, or a move to a new city, though in my case it required all three. It only requires the willingness to understand that your value is not a thing that other people confirm. It is a thing that you carry and protect and act from on an ordinary Thursday morning with coffee in a life that is yours.